Hi everyone, it's Jenny from the WOW Creative team. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to create these 3 cards. They all feature the Emboss Resist technique with ink blending, but for each card we're going to use slightly different products and slightly different techniques to get very different looks. For my first card, I'm going to be using dark coloured cardstock. I'm using teal from Gina Designs. You could use any other colour you want to. You could also use light coloured cardstock, but just not white cardstock. You could even use patterned paper. What we're going to be doing is trapping that colour underneath clear embossing powder. I'm using WOW's Superfine Clear Gloss. They also carry matte as well for a slightly different look without that sheen. So I've added my A2 size panel of cardstock into my Misty. I've used some glue runner on the back just to keep it in place. And then I'm stamping this fantastic large stamped image. It's from the Grey Muse and it's called Happiness Blooms. It's an awesome stamp set. I love it. And I'm stamping it 2 or 3 times towards the bottom of this panel of teal cardstock. I have treated the card with a powder tool just to make sure I don't get any embossing powder sticking where I don't want it to, and then I'm going to heat emboss it in clear. Now, I'm using Distress Oxide inks. That's really important for this first technique because they're opaque. They will cover over the base colour of whatever your cardstock colour is. So I'm using Picked Raspberry, Wilted Violet and Peacock Feathers. I chose Peacock Feathers because I'm going to leave some of that teal cardstock showing at the top, and that was the closest colour of oxide I had. And I've just blended them together over the top of that embossing, and you'll see that it resists the ink. I'm then going to buff it with a microfiber cloth just to make sure you can see that pattern coming through, and you'll see that the teal cardstock still shows through that clear embossing powder, albeit it's slightly darker. Now, I can't resist adding some water splatters because it's Distress Oxide, and you'll see exactly where that blend stops and moves to the real teal cardstock without any ink on it because those water splatters stop as well. So it's a great way to get a perfect fade. I've mounted it on some purple craft foam and then popped that up onto an A2 size white note card. I'm also going to pull one of the sentiments from the set. I'm keeping this card super simple, and I'm using some black cardstock and heat embossing it in opaque bright white embossing powder by WOW before I'll then trim it out. And just because that's going to be the focal point of my card, I can't afford to have this sentiment be wonky. So when I add it to the center of my card, I'm using a T-ruler just to make sure that I get it straight. I normally don't bother. And then to finish off, some sparkling clear sequins in 6mm and 4mm from Pretty Pink Posh. And that finishes my first card. I love how the colours of the oxide ink change over the different colours of cardstock. Now for my second card, I'm going to be using a rainbow array of distress inks, and I'm going to be using this fantastic Gina Designs stamp. It's called Majestic Peony, and I'm starting off doing very similar approach to the first card. I'm using a panel of white cardstock. This is Canson XL watercolour cardstock, and I'm stamping the giant peony right at the bottom of the card, overlapping the edges using my WOW embossing ink. I have treated the panel with a powder tool again, and this time I'm going to be heat embossing in opaque bright white. I am going to be stamping this image 3 times to make sure that that entire panel is covered with flowers and florals from the stamp. So I wanted to make sure I could see where to stamp next, and because embossing ink is clear, it's really hard to see. So I want to make sure that I heat emboss in between each stamping, and I would also therefore recommend that you clean off your stamp in between each stamping, otherwise you're going to get embossing ink sticking where you probably don't want it as you turn that stamp around to fit where you want it. So I flip the stamp around, treating again with my powder tool, inking it back up again and then stamping it. And I love these giant floral stamps. They actually fit together like a jigsaw when you stamp them 2 or 3 times on a A2 size panel. So you'll see I've just got a small corner left there, so I'll go back in and stamp just one of the flower buds up in the top corner. That covers my entire panel. So I'm using these ink blending brushes. These are from Tailored Expressions, and I'm using my Rainbow Distress inks here. You have to be quite careful when you're blending rainbow coloured backgrounds that you don't put complementary colours next to each other, because if you blend them together they can make a murky brown. So I'm thinking your purples and greens you don't really want to put together, that sort of thing. And I'm just blending those colours all over that panel, going back in where I think I might need to. The full list of all of the colours that I used will be linked in the supplies under this video, so you'll be able to see all the colours I used. But you don't have to go with rainbow. You can use any distress ink or any other ink that you can blend over the top, and then go back in with your microfiber cloth, buff it off, and you'll see that that white embossing powder really pops against that background. Of course, I have to use water splatters, and I felt like whilst that showed up a little bit, it wasn't quite doing it for me. So I went back in with some of the inks. That's Picked Raspberry, I think that's Mermaid Lagoon and Twisted Citron, and flicked on some of those as well, just in some places, just not too much, and then dried it with my heat tool. And the dual heat tool by Wow is fantastic for mixed media like this. You use it on setting 1, you can use it to dry the wet ink. And as a finishing touch, I went in with my Nuvo shimmer pen in Midas Touch and added some gold splatters. I've trimmed it down, added some green craft foam to the back, and then popped it onto a white note card. For my sentiment, I'm going to be die cutting some do-it-yourself glitter cardstock. So I'm going to smear my embossing ink pad all over a piece of £100 cardstock, £110 cardstock. And then I'm going to sprinkle on this Fool's Gold embossing glitter from Wow, which is absolutely stunning, super sparkly. And then I will tip it all over that smudged bit of embossing ink on this cardstock, and then heat it up with my heat gun. And if it's not quite opaque enough, you can go back in once it's cooled down with your ink pad and add another layer if you need to. This is actually 2 layers that I'm showing you there. I'm going to then die cut it with this Hello die from Gina Designs. I'll just trim it off slightly because I'm going to be putting it into my small die cutting machine so you can see it. And you'll see that this is quite an intricate die and it still cuts through really well. I do need my pokey tool just to pop out the pieces, but it cut perfectly. So this is a great technique if you don't want to die cut first then heat emboss. Sometimes that can be a little bit fiddly. So I was talking to Marion, this is how she does it, and she's the boss, so I had a go and it works really well. I stacked it up onto 3 more die cuts from white of the Hello die, glued them together and then popped it into the centre of my card panel. I'm then using this stamp set from Gina Designs for my sentiment. It's called Wrapped in Love, and I just really like that sentiment, which I again heat embossed in opaque bright white on black cardstock and added some sparkling clear sequins. And that finishes my second card. Here's a close-up look. Now for my final card, we're going to be doing some select ink blending. I'm using this Outline Winter Floral background stamp from Simon Says Stamp. It's quite a fine design. I thought that was a really good idea to use something that's got a lot of wide open space. It makes it a little bit easier for this technique. I'm stamping it onto Canson XL watercolour cardstock again. I have treated it with my powder tool, and then I'm going to heat emboss it in metallic silver superfine embossing powder. This is one of my favourite Wow embossing powders. When you heat it up, it goes so shiny and glossy. Some of the other metallic colours take on a slightly more kind of matte look. This one is so shiny. I just love it. And it's a really classy look just like that, but we're going to be doing some ink blending. So this time I'm using my mini ink daubers, and I'm choosing selectively where to add colours. I'm going for a Christmassy look here, so I'm using different colours of red. I'm using Abandoned Coral. I'm using Festive Berries, I think. So I'm just sort of inking up those flowers with the ink dauber, and then coming in with some of the brown distress ink on the branches. And then I'll come in with some greens on the leaves. I'm using Lucky Clover, and I think I come in with some Twisted Citron. And you'll see I'm not being too careful to stay inside the lines. You don't really need to for this technique, and you'll see why in a minute. But try and get them as close as possible. The tricky part on the colour combination I'm using here is trying not to mix the green and red together too much, because it does make a bit of a murky brown. And I'm coming in here with an ink blender that hasn't got any ink on it, just to lightly soften those harsh edges. I'm then using a mini mister just filled with clear water and giving a few spritzes on this panel. What that will do is makes the ink sort of pop a little bit more, but also blend very slightly those colours together, get rid of all of those harsh edges caused by the ink dauber. It also gives that wonderful distressed look, and I can dry it on setting 1 with my heat tool. Again, I wanted to add a bit more of a Christmassy feel, so I'm adding some sparkling shimmer spray to some white acrylic paint and splattering that on for good measure. And again, that will cover up any of the more harsh lines that hadn't been softened by the water spritz. I can then come in with my microfiber cloth and buff it off. I've trimmed it down and popped it up onto some green fun foam, and then I'm going to mount that. I'm now going to be repeating the same technique we did before for die cutting our sentiments. So I've smushed my ink pad onto this scrap of white 110-pound cardstock, and then I'm heat embossing it with primary Chartreuse. It's a slightly translucent, lovely floral green colour. And I do add a couple of layers again to this one, but I love that gloss. Look at it, super shiny. And I'm going to be die cutting this with the Big Hugs Sugar Script die from Birch Press Design. I've cut the secondary layer just from some vellum, and then I've die cut that top layer. I'm going to be die cutting that top layer from the heat embossed panel. And once again, it die cuts absolutely perfectly. The one thing I would say is a craft pick is really handy just to get that embossed piece out. For some reason, embossed pieces sometimes have a tendency to stick inside the die itself. And then I'm going to adhere those 2 layers together, and then on the back I'm going to add some thin Derice foam tape strips just to the backs of the letters and pop it up into the centre of my panel. I'm going to be using a sub-sentiment. This set from Tailored Expressions is amazing. It's red rubber. You can stamp all these sentiments in one go, which I'm doing here onto black cardstock. And then I'm going to add the metallic silver and heat emboss it. I thought the metallic silver would coordinate, but also silver on black's very classic, and I can use all of these sentiments on other cards. And this is the coordinating die. It fits over the top perfectly, and you have tons and tons of sentiments that you can use on cards forever. It's genius. So I'm going to be choosing one of these, and I didn't really think about this. I was like, okay, hugs. I like this one that says I miss your face. So I used that one. And my husband pointed out, they said, I miss your face hugs, which might remind you of a horror film called Alien. So anyway, apologies to anyone who actually gets this card off me. It was completely unintentional. I've gone in and embellished the rest of the card with some vintage drops and jewel drops in red, just to add some berries and some gloss to the centre of the flowers. And that finishes my video. Thanks so much for watching. Have an awesome day. Bye.